All right, may I have your attention, please? May I direct you back to up here because we have a lot this afternoon, and definitely please continue to talk among one another. But after, right after, later on, after the panels and so on. Okay. It's my honor to introduce the luncheon speaker today, but I'm going to begin by talking about Pierre Asselin, right, who is like the first name on the list of roll calls that we had this morning. Anyway, Professor Asselin, in case you don't know him, come and talk to him in English, French, Vietnamese, any other languages? Okay, those three languages. A former a resident of French-speaking regions of Canada, Pierre found his way to Hawaii, where he learned Vietnamese and studied with Professor Trung Bu Lam, among others. And that is where he received his PhD. And long story short, he is now a professor of history at San Diego State University. Okay, so here, this is the connection to to my introduction. 2 years ago, Pierre graciously emailed me to invite a contribution to a chapter, in a volume that he and others are editing, The Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. It's a 3-volume, that he and several other historians are editing, and I want to recognize Adrian Minchow out there, who is like, hopefully they paid your labor, because she did a lot of work behind the scene as well. But anyway, the chapter that Pierre invited me to write is on the diaspora, and I said, yes, of course I will. Okay, guess what? I tried, and I said, oh, this is not gonna work. I tried a second draft. I said, this is so hard. I tried a third draft, and I think, okay. Sorry, I wanted to yell so that people can hear me. Sorry about that. Okay. But finally, I think it was my 4th draft that it worked, okay? And this is what I realized. Take a look at the title of the speaker's presentation, okay? I realized that I cannot write about the Vietnamese diaspora. I have to write about the Vietnamese diasporas, plural, okay? And that was the key to it. And anyway, I was delighted, when I was asked to introduce Professor Natalie Huỳnh Châu Nguyen, diasporas with an extra S, Natalie with an H. That's how I remember your name, Professor Nguyen. And she is a faculty at Monash University in Australia for many, many years. She has also served as a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. She has researched on a number of topics, but mostly, at least from what I've read of her many books and articles, right, on soldiers and officers of the Republic of Vietnam military. She has interviewed and written about women, Vietnamese women, including Vietnamese women in the South Vietnamese Army. Some pretty original research. And last but not least, she is the editor, talking about editing, another big book of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of the Vietnamese Diaspora. So please join me in welcoming Professor Giáo sư Natalie Nguyen.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yep. Okay, so I would like to thank Tuong Vu for inviting me to give this luncheon address, and Tuan Huang for his kind introduction. Good afternoon to you all. Okay, so starting with this really powerful quote by Quỳnh Đào. The sky and the sea soon merged into one vast expanse of blackness. Behind me, beyond me, there was nothing that I could see. My past had gone, and there was no trail tracing my future. So Quỳnh Đào was 18 years old when she escaped from Vietnam by boat with her siblings in 1978. Her memoir details her childhood in Đà Lạt, her family history, the burning of her family's books and confiscation of their home by the North Vietnamese Army in 1975, her experience of post-war forced labor, and the events that led her to becoming a boat person 3 years after the fall of Saigon. Her words convey the profound rupture in refugee lives. Diasporas involve leaving one's homeland, creating new lives and communities overseas, remembering and reimagining the home and the homeland, and crafting connections with the homeland and with other new communities overseas. In one of the most significant and visible mass migrations of the late 20th century, more than 2 million Vietnamese left their country in the 20 years that followed the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. The plight of the boat people received international recognition. The extent of this diaspora was unprecedented in Vietnamese history, as was the international response, which saw 2 major conferences convened by the UN in Geneva in 1979 and 1989, and the resettlement of Vietnamese in 50 countries worldwide. The post-1975 Vietnamese refugee movement reflects the original articulation of diaspora in that, first, it was a forced migration associated with trauma and exile. Second, Vietnamese were resettled in a wide range of countries. And third, transnational relationships between Vietnamese overseas communities and the homeland, as well as between the communities themselves, continued to evolve. The refugee nature of the diaspora means that the orientation of diasporic Vietnamese towards the Vietnamese homeland can be fraught and in many ways divorced from the Vietnamese government. Homeland for the first generation of the diaspora may refer to the former Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam, the country that was lost in 1975 and lives on in memory. But for the second and later generations, it may signify an increasingly distant country associated with their parents or with previous generations. As noted by Ian Le Spiritu and Tom Chan, how do young Vietnamese who have never been home imagine the homeland? And how do they recall that which is somewhere else and that which was perhaps never known, unquote? Whether diasporic Vietnamese will continue to maintain a strong and distinct Vietnamese identity over the longue durée is yet to be seen. But the refugee experience and the impact of traumatic loss and grief have left an enduring legacy for the younger generations overseas. The Vietnamese government estimates that there are 5.3 million Vietnamese living and working in 130 countries and territories. The post-1975 diaspora is the largest and most widely known of what I characterize as the 4 broad categories of modern Vietnamese diasporas. So colonial, socialist, refugee, and 21st century labor and social mobilities. The Vietnamese refugee diaspora has received more exposure than the others, but each category displays considerable internal variation depending on the individuals, communities, populations, and countries involved. I will now map and analyze these 4 diasporas. So colonial legacies, part 1. Prior to French colonization in 1887, Vietnamese migration was largely confined to the Indochinese peninsula. Vietnamese civil servants worked and lived in Cambodia and Laos during the French colonial period, and Vietnamese scholars, revolutionaries, and students went to France, China, Thailand, and Japan in the first half of the 20th century. Vietnamese indentured laborers worked in the nickel mines of New Caledonia in the 19th and 20th centuries. Approximately 90,000 Indochinese men were sent to France to aid the war effort in World War I. In 1918, 30% of the colonial labor force was Indochinese. On 27th May 1918, at the Chemin des Dames, 150 Vietnamese soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans. And although no precise figures exist, it is estimated that 8,000 Vietnamese soldiers workers died in France during World War I. On the eve of World War II, the French set about rebuilding their colonial labor and military force, and 27,000 Vietnamese arrived in France in 1939-40. This number included 20,000 workers and 7,000 tirailleurs, or indigenous infantrymen. Following the 1940 armistice, 4,500 Vietnamese were repatriated, but the rest were forced to remain in France. The Vietnamese worked in rural areas before moving to urban industries in 1942-43, and in 1944 were dispersed to different parts of France. The successful revival of rice cultivation in Camargue is due to the Vietnamese laboring there from 1941. Vietnamese with French nationality were repatriated to France after the end of the Indochina War in 1954. Now, the refugee diaspora. The mass migration of Vietnamese were from one state to another took place on only 2 occasions in the 20th century. First, after partition in 1954, when 1 million refugees left communist North Vietnam for Republican South Vietnam. And second, after the end of the Vietnam War, when over 2 million people left Vietnam. The significant refugee movement from north to south in 1954-56 involved between 5 and 10% of the population of North Vietnam and is often overshadowed by the post-1975 diaspora. But many of those who formed part of that first mass migration then took part in the later migration, making them twice refugees from communism. And this was very much the case of my father's family, because he comes from a family in North Vietnam with a history that goes back to the 16th century. It was a very large Buddhist family, and someone in the earlier panel mentioned Nguyen Ngoc Bích. So Nguyen Ngoc Bích was one of my father's cousins, so I used to call him Bác Bích. So the post-1975 Vietnamese diaspora was driven by widespread state repression and human rights violations in post-war communist Vietnam, including forced displacement and forced labor. 1 million people were interned in re-education camps, and another 1 million people were forcibly de-urbanized and displaced to new economic zones in rural areas. Freedom of speech and movement were curtailed, businesses nationalized, agriculture collectivized, and much private property confiscated. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam discriminated against 3 specific groups in society. First, all those associated with the former South Vietnamese government, including service personnel and civil servants, as well as their families. Second, ethnic Chinese. And third, Amerasians. The extent of state repression led to the fragmentation of social and familial networks in the former South, as relatives disappeared into the re-education camps, new economic zones, or as escapees. 2 additional wars that Vietnam engaged in, both against former communist allies, the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 and Cambodian-Vietnamese War from 1978 to 89, contributed to further departures from Vietnam. Now, in addition to the 839,000 Vietnamese who reached UNHCR-administered refugee camps in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, 134,000 were evacuated directly to the US in 1975 and don't feature in UNHCR statistics. 263,000 fled to the People's Republic of China in 1978-79, and over 623,000 left under the Orderly Departure Program, or ODP, that has been mentioned in this conference before. Now, these numbers do not include the dead and the missing of the exodus, estimated at between 100,000 and more than 1 million. And what I tell my students is, from what boat people have said to me, is that they believe that for every boat that made it, one didn't. So nearly 1 million made it to UNHCR camps, and so people believe that nearly 1 million did not make it. Total departures from Vietnam were therefore well over 2 million. In 1978-79, the Vietnamese government was involved with overseas crime syndicates in organizing the trafficking of refugees, charging them an average of $2,000 per person in gold and confiscating their houses and goods. It was a convenient way for Vietnamese authorities to dispose of so-called undesirables, whether members of the ethnic Chinese minority or opponents to the communist regime, and reap material benefit in the process. Refugees were supposed to be guaranteed a safe passage, but for many it proved to be a one-way journey to a watery grave. Refugees not only disappeared at sea or on overland escape routes, but also drowned in rivers even before reaching the sea. Vietnamese living in riverine and coastal communities in the south remember seeing countless corpses floating by or washed up on riverbanks or beaches in the post-war years. It is one of the great tragedies of the Vietnamese exodus that the number of dead will never truly be known. Refugees died when they were shot at by Vietnamese patrol boats, or when their boats sank in rough weather. They died of thirst or starvation, were raped or killed by pirates, or died after their boats were pushed back out to sea by other jurisdictions. In spite of measures taken by the international community to combat piracy in the region, attacks against boat people continued, with Paul Hartling, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, referring in 1984 to cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity that go beyond his imagination. The South China Sea became, in the words of Mary Terrell Cargill and Jake Quang Huynh, a vast burial ground. The legacy of this history of loss and trauma for Vietnamese refugees is manifested in the Vietnamese diaspora and the second generation overseas, as families still grieve for missing members 30 to 40 years after their disappearance. And this is the case with my sister-in-law. She lost 5 family members at sea, and her family still refuses to say that they are dead. Now 30 to 40 years later, they still refer to these family members as missing, because at the back of their minds, there is still the hope. She actually said, when my book, Memories in Another Country, was published, I've got a photograph of her sister in that book, a beautiful image. She was a beautiful young woman. And my sister-in-law said, I hope people will read her book, and I hope someone will recognize her photograph, because maybe she fell overboard and she knocked her head and she lost her memory, and someone saved her and she's alive somewhere. So it is very difficult for family members to accept, the loss of loved ones, even after all this time. Refugees are not simply passive victims of history. Their decision to leave their homeland represents a statement of agency and a means of expressing their rejection of their country's political regime. As noted by Linda Hitchcock, once having left Vietnam as a refugee, a Vietnamese is not only separated from his homeland, but has also demonstrated publicly his opposition to the policies of his government. This outcome is inevitable and implicit in the action, whatever the motivation of a particular refugee. The Vietnamese refugee diaspora comprised 3 major waves. The first wave departed in the closing days of the war in 1975 and included South Vietnamese military and civil personnel and those who had been employed by the Americans, as well as ordinary citizens who fled in the chaos of the final days. While 134,000 were resettled in the US, another 60,000 were sent to refugee camps in Hong Kong and Thailand. The first wave signaled the start of a much larger movement. The second wave of refugees peaked in 1978-79, following increasing political repression in the South, including forced relocations and forced labor. Campaigns against business and trade targeted Vietnam's 1.5 million strong ethnic Chinese minority, and many fled the country. The scale of this migration was unprecedented in Vietnamese history, and the response of the international community was equally unprecedented. The UN organized 2 international conferences to deal specifically with the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis. The first was called by UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim and was held in July 1979 with 65 countries attending. The emotional tone of the conference was set by US Vice President Walter Mondale, who referred to the failure of the Evian Conference 41 years earlier to save the Jews of Germany and Austria. The major outcomes of the conference were the following. First, industrialized countries pledged to substantially increase the number of resettlement offers. And second, the orderly departure, or ODP, was established, which allowed Vietnamese to leave their country legally after they had been accepted for resettlement overseas. Vietnamese boat people were granted prima facie refugee status. Now, the number of boat people gradually abated in the early 1980s, although significant numbers continued to leave Vietnam. In 1986, a new group of refugees arrived in Hong Kong. They differed from earlier refugees in that they were ethnic Vietnamese from northern Vietnam, and half were children. International agencies expressed reservations about these refugees, as North Vietnam had been communist since 1954, although refugee advocates argued that it was difficult to separate political from economic factors in a communist state. This new group were judged to be, quote unquote, economic migrants, a view that became widespread and was extended to refugees from southern and central Vietnam. Officials now refer to compassion fatigue, and in 1988, Hong Kong announced that it would establish screening procedures for asylum seekers, and Southeast Asian countries followed suit in 1989. Now, the third wave peaked with the final surge of boat people in 1989-90 as Vietnamese sought to reach first asylum camps before screening procedures cut in. The second UN Conference on Indochinese Refugees was held in June 1989. Attended by 70 countries, the outcome of this conference was the Comprehensive Plan of Action, or CPA. Its purpose was to stem illegal departures from Vietnam, encourage legal emigration, establish refugee screening procedures, continue to resettle those eligible, and repatriate those who had been rejected as refugees. Under these new procedures, 32,000 asylum seekers were accepted as refugees, and 83,000 were denied refugee status and told to repatriate. Many refused to do so. In 1995, the decision was taken to forcibly repatriate remaining camp detainees, and the only country that refused to forcibly repatriate the Vietnamese was the Philippines, the poorest of the first asylum countries. The last camp in Hong Kong ceased to operate in 2000 and put an end after a quarter of a century to one of the longest-running migration and refugee resettlement programs in the modern era. The four main Western countries of resettlement for Vietnamese refugees were the US, Australia, Canada, and France. The US has the largest number of Vietnamese at 2.3 million. Australia is next with 34,785 people. Then France with approximately 300 to 350,000. There are sort of some issues with French statistics. And Canada with 275,530 people. The Vietnamese exodus had a significant impact on migration policy and legislation in Australia and the US. It prompted Australia's adoption of its first explicit refugee policy in 1977, and in the US, a new legislation relating to refugee admission in the form of the Refugee Act of 1980. Vietnamese communities were established in countries as diverse as Norway and Israel. The histories of these communities, the process of adaptation of the Vietnamese to their respective host countries, and transgenerational negotiations of acculturation and identity are ongoing examples of diasporic communities adjusting to resettlement. The first generation of Vietnamese refugees that had first-hand experience of war and forced migration is either aging or disappearing. Memory in this context is particularly important. As noted by Katharina, inhabiting the space of discontinuities, diasporas, through remembering, can reinsert themselves into familiar frames that reaffirm their histories, genealogies, identities, and above all, sense of belonging. Memory, thus, is a salve against the ravages of exile. Recording and preserving the experiences of this first generation is vital. Oral history is a means of creating and establishing an archive of primary sources, and as part of national, state, or community collections, provides an essential means of preserving these voices for the national record and for future generations. And it was a real joy to hear the previous panel because, there's so many people involved with oral history and with archives. So moving on to socialist labor migrations. The other major Vietnamese migration that occurred in the second half of the 20th century was that of students and contract workers from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the DRV, and later the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, from the 1950s until 1990. These socialist state-linked movements followed the establishment of diplomatic relations between the DRV and the Soviet Union and its satellite states in 1950 and were intended to be temporary. At their height, they involved a labor force of nearly 300,000 Vietnamese in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. However, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to changed conditions for Vietnamese labor migrants. Socialist state-linked migrations form a counterpoint to the Vietnamese refugee movement that took place in the last quarter of the 20th century. In her work on 3 generations of Vietnamese students in the communist bloc, Guistina notes that the first generation did not have a choice in terms of what to study or where, as that decision was made by the Vietnamese state. Nevertheless, these students benefited from socio-political stability in the form of government jobs when they returned to the DRV. The second generation was given the opportunity to take up 3-year jobs overseas and gain socio-political stability and economic mobility. And the third generation achieved economic gains, but returnees experienced the devaluation of their degrees after Doi Moi in 1986 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the 1980s, almost 300,000 mostly unskilled Vietnamese worked under bilateral labor agreements in the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and towards the end of the 1980s in Poland. Vietnam's wars with China and Cambodia had made it economically and militarily dependent on the Soviet Union. Eastern Bloc countries were in need of cheap labor, while Vietnam benefited from remittances, including a 12% tax levied on Vietnamese workers overseas. As noted by Schwenkel, monies acquired through bilateral agreements with socialist friends went towards national reconstruction and to paying off debts. In 1987 alone, for example, Vietnam collected 43.6 million marks from workers in East Germany. Vietnamese labor migrants also played an important role in the exchange of commodities between the irregular or parallel economies that existed in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and the black market in Vietnam and other countries in Asia. Vietnamese in East Germany noticed a shift from socialist fraternity during the war years to resentment in the post-war years. When the Soviet Union broke apart, bilateral agreements between communist states fell through, and Vietnamese workers had to decide whether to return to Vietnam or to stay in Europe. And many of them decided to shift westwards. So East Germany, they went from East Germany to West Germany. In Poland, which had few Vietnamese migrants before the late 1980s, Vietnamese migration, including illegal migration, increased significantly after 1990. Russia has the largest Vietnamese community in Eastern Europe, estimated at between 100,000 to 150,000, including irregular migrants, followed by an estimated 90,000 in the Czech Republic and 25 to 35,000 in Poland. State-linked migrations imply that those involved maintain ties with the homeland and with the Vietnamese government. Vietnamese communities overseas, however, vary considerably. A 2015 analysis of the Vietnamese Tet Festival in Poland, for example, reveals competing celebrations between official Vietnamese organizations with ties to the Vietnamese government and pro-democracy Vietnamese and Polish activists, with both factions seeking to appeal to younger Vietnamese and the wider Polish community. Now, 21st century mobilities. In the 21st century, Vietnamese mobilities are linked to labor, education, and marriage. There are more than 600,000 Vietnamese workers in over 40 countries worldwide, according to the International Labour Organization. Vietnam is the third largest remittance recipient in the East Asia and Pacific region, with $19 billion in remittances, accounting for 4.6% of GDP, and those figures are from the World Bank in 2022. The top 3 destinations for Vietnamese workers overseas are Taiwan, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. There were 132,000 and plus Vietnamese students studying at tertiary level overseas in 2020, with the largest number, 44,000, in Japan, followed by 25,000 in the US, 19,000 in the Republic of Korea, and nearly 16,000 in Australia, after which numbers fall to 5 figures or below. Approximately 14,000 Vietnamese women move abroad as marriage migrants each year. A significant proportion of these marriage migrations involve illegal brokerage as a form of human trafficking. Oh. Now, Vietnamese American, Vietnamese Australian, and Vietnamese Canadian writers of the 1.5 and second generations have risen to prominence over the last 25 years, with major award winners including Monique T. D. Trung, Nam Le Kim Thuy, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, among others. In France, the writer Linda Lay won several literary prizes before her untimely death in 2022. Although works in English and in French predominate, Vietnamese literary and cultural production reflects the diversity of countries and languages of the diaspora, and new writers and artists continue to emerge and flourish in the 21st century. Vietnamese Israeli Van Nguyen, for example, published a poetry collection in Hebrew in 2013 entitled The Truffle Eye. The English translation of her work won a translation award from the American Academy of Poets last year. Diasporic literary and cultural production deals with trauma, rupture, and transcultural and transgenerational exchanges and negotiations, as well as transnational subjectivities and mobilities. Now, in conclusion, researching and writing on the Vietnamese diaspora can be intensely personal, as many of those working in the field are from the diaspora and are shaped by the diasporic experience. The intersection between the personal and the professional may not only drive such work, but also explain its emotional and psychological toll. The positionality of the researcher and writer are central to the work of analyzing and interpreting diasporic histories and cultural production. And I'm very conscious of this because I'm a member of the 1.5 generation, as is the case with some other presenters here. I arrived as a child refugee in Australia. My father was from the north, my mother was from the south. And I'm very conscious of where I come from in terms of when I introduce myself to potential interviewees. I mean, oral histories really involve a gesture of trust between the interviewee and the interviewer. And that gesture of trust is really important in traumatized refugee communities. So it's an aspect of my work that, that's hugely important, the ethics of the oral history, oral history research. Translating the experiences of diasporic Vietnamese is not only a process of translation between past and present, but also between generations that grew up in different cultures and languages. The experience of diaspora is profoundly transformative, altering and reshaping individual lives, families, and communities, as well as host societies and countries. Diasporic cultural production and scholarship emphasize multiple interpretations, representations, and reconstructions of diaspora and the diasporic experience. They highlight the variety of Vietnamese diasporic journeys, trajectories, and communities, as well as the richness and depth of Vietnamese diasporic literary and cultural production. They point to a constantly evolving terrain in which diasporic Vietnamese negotiate histories, identities, and subjectivities, and in which they engage in dialogue with their communities and host societies, as well as other communities overseas, and where ultimately they reflect on and interpret the homeland, whether real or imaginary. Thank you.
Would you like to stay there to answer you? We have about 5 minutes or so for questions, before we have to move on to the next thing. Alex, would you be ready? In the meantime, if I may just add one quick comment. Do we have time to? Okay. I thank you, Natalie, for really open out, introducing us to the complexity of the diaspora, right? I mean, we haven't even talk about Vietnamese diaspora in Thailand, for example, right? Who have lived there for decades, before the revolution and all that. And then, do you know, for example, and I learned this on, through scholars, that Argentina, there were Vietnamese refugees in Argentina, in addition to Israel and, other countries that you name.
In Africa as well.
I'm sorry?
In Africa as well.
In South Africa, yes, definitely. So it's amazing when we think, right, about the complexities of the diaspora experience in the last century, if not beyond. So please.
Any question, anybody?
Maybe one.
Thank you, Natalie, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I really love the work, and I think for all of us who are Vietnamese Americans and who work in Vietnamese American context, it's really important to think about our communities in relationship to like all these other diasporic formations. So my question to you with the work that you're doing is, what do we gain when we take a deeper historical look at the ways in which our communities across the world have been found? And what are the challenges of all of us trying to understand these kinds of complex histories? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking, when I was doing research for I had to write the introductory chapter to the volume since I'm editor. It took a huge amount of work. I got totally stressed out. So I understand what you went through, Tuan, because at one stage I did freak out completely. And I thought, anyway, it's interesting to look at it from a historical perspective. And, I mentioned the longue durée because, the longue durée refers to to several generations over a long period of time. And, in that context, the Vietnamese diaspora is extremely young. It really dates from after the end of the Vietnam War. Yes, there were Vietnamese who resettled in France, from the beginning of the 20th century, but that's a small and that's quite a specific community. Yes, there are Vietnamese who settled in New Caledonia from the end of the 19th century, again, a tiny community. But essentially, the main communities, especially in the West, were from 1975, from the end of the Vietnam War. I mean, there were about 1,000 Vietnamese who were in Australia before the end of the war, about 1,000 Vietnamese in Canada, about 15,000 here in the US before the end of the war. But these huge communities were established following the end of the war, and more to the point, the refugee movement, this huge refugee movement that followed, the end of the Vietnam War. So it's a very young community. And I guess the historical approach is interesting because you can observe what has happened to other communities. This whole issue of, how trauma is transferred from one generation to another. And I mean, I'm currently working on my 5th book at the moment, which is tentatively entitled The Vietnamese Refugee Legacy, the Second Generation. So once again, based on very detailed oral histories of second generation Vietnamese, and some very, very moving accounts of how the second generation, which did not experience war or the boat experience directly, how they're processing what their parents and what their grandparents have been through. And there are cases of artists, dealing with that in very moving ways. So one of them is a young Vietnamese Australian artist who had an exhibition in Melbourne in which for 1 week he lived on the same rations his parents survived on as boat people. So what Australians could do, or anyone who walked past his exhibition, was that they could go in, put on earphones and listen to boat refugee stories while they folded paper boats. So at the end of that time, I asked him, what was that experience like? And he said he couldn't understand what his parents went through. He tried, but he wasn't on a boat in the middle of nowhere. But I think that the fact that he tried, that he lived on these rations for 1 week, was very moving. It was his way of trying to tell his parents, I'm trying to understand what it is that you went through. And a lot of his artistic production is based around the boat, the refugee movement, and the trauma and the losses associated with that movement. So these are some of the things that the second generation is dealing with. Yeah. And in terms of what you can learn, obviously the Vietnamese American diaspora is the largest. It's huge, it's dominant. but I think you also need to remember it's not the only one.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
there are very large Vietnamese communities, you know, in Australia and in Canada, proportionately to the size of the population.
Yeah.
The Vietnamese community in France has its own very distinct history, and I find it fascinating to, you know, to look at the histories, for example, of Vietnamese who resettled in Israel. There was a fascinating documentary on the Vietnamese community in Israel and Vietnamese who serve in the Israeli Defense Force. And that's happening in, you know, in lots of other communities. So my interest was in Vietnamese, for example, who serve in the Australian Defense Force. So what it is that motivates, you know, Vietnamese to, you know, to serve Australia. And so I was interested in the gentleman who served in the U.S. Marines.
Kenneth?
Yes, sorry, you were talking. Yeah, no, I was interested because you said you served in the US Marines, and I've interviewed a lot of second-generation Vietnamese Australians who serve in the Australian Defence Force, so in the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force. And it's fascinating to talk to them, men and women, and especially the women. A lot of Vietnamese women are pretty small, and I've said to them, how do you manage to get through the physical examination? I mean, the physical tests. And they've said to me, willpower. I mean, they're genuinely petite. They have to carry this incredibly heavy load. And, you know, as one of them said, you know, her first run, she was struggling at the end. Someone took her backpack, someone else took her gun, someone else took the helmet that she had to wear, and she was still struggling right at the end. But by the end of her training, she made it. So a lot of willpower to get these young people to enter the Royal Australian Navy or the Royal Australian Air Force. One of them was a really interesting account of a Vietnamese man. He was the only son of his family who became a woman and then joined and, you know, became an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force. And his parents, who very much struggled with all of this initially, are now very proud of their daughter because she's an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force. So some fascinating accounts and histories.
Yeah.
A
We
question here.
definitely want to leave a minute to, you know, for the summary.
Tuấn, Tuấn,
Oh, yes?
Tuấn, right here,
Okay.
back here. We still have time, so we can take a few more questions.
Okay, all right. Phương?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a quick methodological question. It seems in my experience and the experience of a lot of other people that history has been one of the toughest tasks to do for Vietnamese people. And, you know, I think in the old days, maybe we used to think that language barriers or cultural barriers might have been one of the major impediments, but another one that maybe we don't talk about, and I'm maybe no pun intended, is silence. Is that one of the biggest obstacles to recovering history is that because of trauma, people don't want to talk about these experiences, or if they do it in these very vague and undecipherable platitudes. Like, we left our country because we wanted to live in freedom or democracy, but can you tell me more than that? And oftentimes, you know, we don't get much out of it. I remember Alex Tai showed me a video back in the day. It was probably a college video of a young Vietnamese woman who was mad at her parents, said she hated being Vietnamese, and it was only by going through the library at whatever college she was at and reading through books about the war that she finally reached some kind of reconciliation with her family that kind of it's kind of like a, what's the Amy Tan book? A Joy Luck Club kind of moment, right? Where she can reconcile with the older generation and recover what was missing. But at the time, those books didn't exist. And there are still people today whose parents refuse to talk about the past. You mentioned Viet Thanh Nguyen. His own father, you know, who's like 80-something years old, still doesn't talk about the past at all. After all this rambling, what kind of methodological approaches did you use, or were you lucky in what ways were you able to get people to finally speak up about these things?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, the issue of silence is a huge one, but that's why I'm doing the work that I do. And I think that in terms of oral history, I mean, I'm genuinely interested in people's stories. And I mean, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without that. So the sort of oral histories that I do are extremely detailed. I mean, I would spend the entire day with the person, with breaks in between. And I spoke about trust earlier, because you would only entrust, very painful elements in your life to someone whom you trust. Now, the issue as to why people open up, because I had the same questions not only with a very large project I did on Vietnamese women that resulted in 2 books, but also the project that I did on South Vietnamese veterans. Because people ask me, people are not willing to talk about that. Are they going to talk to you? And I said, well, I really hope so, because if they don't talk to me, I can't actually do my work. And I think I think part of the reason why people, talk to me is because I'm part of the diaspora, but I'm not too close. So I was a child, when I arrived in Australia. My Vietnamese is not that great. And so there are there's some vulnerabilities in terms of the interviewee relationship. So when I interview people in Vietnamese, it's extremely hard for me. It takes a lot of concentration for me to listen to them and understand them. But clearly, they would be more comfortable, giving their life stories in Vietnamese. So I always say to them, whatever language you're most at ease with. And luckily, with the veterans, there were many who were perfectly fluent in English and were very happy to be interviewed in English, but others preferred to be interviewed in Vietnamese. So I think the fact that, and because my parents were quite active in the community, many people had known me as a child, or had heard of my parents and knew that I was their child. So in a way, I think, for those interviews, it's good to be close, but perhaps not too close. So I'm not outside of the community, but I'm not so, I'll give a concrete example of this. One of the women I interviewed for my second book, Voyage of Hope, she was interviewed in Vietnamese by a Vietnamese research assistant. And she knew this woman. Both of them worked in the social welfare sector in Australia. And the only thing she would say about her marriage was that it was difficult. So she mentioned it a few times, and then she basically stopped. And so I was going through the interview, and I contacted her, and I said, dear Ko, and I said, would you mind very much if I interviewed you again? And she very kindly said yes. So I went in. I asked her if it was, would it be okay to interview her in English? And then this incredibly detailed life story came out, and she was beaten so badly by her husband that she had to be hospitalized. So this was what she had meant in Vietnamese, why things were a bit difficult. None of that came through in the Vietnamese language interview, but it all came out in the much longer English language interview that that she granted me. So I think in some ways, with the other Vietnamese women, they knew each other in a professional capacity. They saw each other, and maybe she felt it was just too much for her to reveal all these intimate details of her life. With me, she knew I was an academic, so I was not someone she would meet all the time. And luckily, she trusted me enough to give these very painful details of her life and the issue of family violence and gender violence, within her family.
Thank you.
So that's an example.
A question from Will.
Just a brief question about terminology. Do you make any kind of academic distinction between the word Việt Kiều versus Người Việt Hải Ngoại?
I don't use either term. I think I just leave it to people and I don't use it in my writing either, because I know that for some members of the community, they don't appreciate that vocabulary. So I don't use either.
Can I have the privilege to ask one question?
Yeah.
If it's possible. I was this is for Natalie, but also I guess for all of us to contemplate. The past 2 days we talk a lot about the refugees experience of Vietnamese American in the context of Vietnamese who left after 75 in the 80s and in the 90s,
In the 90s,
right?
yeah.
And then your talk, you have the fourth section, right? Those who left during the socialist era, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so there's that complexity in terms of relations, right, with Vietnamese who came before and who came currently, right? And you can see that change in all these communities. For example, in Norway, Sweden, you see that those who came before versus those who came now, or during the third wave, right?
Yeah.
They don't really interact with each other, right? In Little Saigon right now, right? We call it Little Saigon, but actually if you go back to Little Saigon and you travel around, you speak to people, they say it's no longer Little Saigon, it's Little Hanoi, right? There are people who perceive that. You go to Montreal, right? It's not Phở 54, but it's Phở Lý Quốc Sư, right? So there's that change that is happening right now. So that relations between those who have this identity, this immigrant or refugees identity versus those who come because of economics, educational, or other reasons. How are they and how are we kind of, I don't know, understand this relation and make sense of this relation? Right?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. I think it's a really interesting one, and I think it does come down to family. I mean, you know, I have family members from the north because my father was from the north, and the issue of the different waves. I mean, I'll say a couple of things. One is that even if for people who came under so-called family reunion, or even people who come out in the 21st century, it does not mean that they're not linked to the refugee movement, because many people tried repeatedly to escape and failed. So it's an interesting area of scholarship. You know, what happened to the people who failed? So one of the women I interviewed, for example, her family tried twice to escape from Vietnam. They were a Vietnamese Chinese family, and then they ran out of money. So she didn't have a choice anymore. But for 20 years after that, you know, she had one goal in mind, because she wanted to escape. She wanted to be educated. And so she persisted for 20 years, and then she finally did leave Vietnam. So nominally, she wasn't a refugee, but her whole mentality, you know, everything that motivated her to leave Vietnam was driven by the same, you know, much the same reasons, you know, as the boat people exodus. So even in the 21st century, people who leave might have family members who were refugees or who resettled overseas, and this might be a contributing factor to them wanting to leave the country. But yes, in terms of those who leave as students, obviously they're part of the Vietnamese elite, and generally students would be members of the party because that's what is expected of them. So Australia, for example, has quite large numbers of students. And it's interesting to see, you know, the way, you know, they adjust to Australian life, to education in Australia. So one of the students I spoke to, she finished a PhD in Australia. She's now working, you know, in the postgraduate sector. She was talking about a very good friend from Vietnam who came to Deakin University in Australia. He thought, right, I'm in a free country now, I can do whatever I want. He became very, very active on human rights blogs, and unfortunately for him, the Vietnamese government found out. And so he can't go home. He can't go home to visit his family. So there are consequences, you know, that people often don't think about. And there are consequences for Vietnamese Australian academics. There was a colleague from Victoria University, again, very active on human rights blogs. He took his students to Vietnam. His students were let through. He was deported back to Australia. So when I took my students to Vietnam in 2016 and 2017, I was very nervous. You know, I was very nervous when I applied for a visa, and I just wanted to make sure that, you know, I could be there with my students in terms of taking them to Vietnam. And I mean, the course that I was teaching was called In the Footsteps of Refugees. So I took them to Vietnam and then to Galang camp in Indonesia, so that they could see, you know, some of the few traces of the refugee movement. And someone asked earlier about, you know, in terms of the archives and the history. And I know that Con has worked on this in terms of refugee memorials, and it's the fragility of that, you know, of physical, you know, remnants of that movement, because of all, you know, that vast network of camps that existed throughout Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, only Galang really has been preserved. I think there are remnants in Bidong as well, but most of the, the actual physical remnants of the camps have disappeared. And one of my students, one of my students was a Jewish student. So we went to Galang. I don't know if many of you have been there, but there is this tiny museum, with photographs. But I mean, the windows are open, the photographs are yellowing. And I mean, he was comparing that to museums, regarding the Shoah. And he was very saddened to see that. He said, why isn't there more money invested in preserving that refugee history? So it's the fragility and the fact that there are so few physical traces and that those traces are disappearing, which brings us all back to memory. And the issue of how, we're preserving that, and, clearly oral history is one way of actually preserving that history.
Okay, I think we are about out of time. Would you like to give a summary?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Natalie Nguyen, for one of the most intellectually thought-provoking and stimulating talks in this conference. And so I'm going to start with how Natalie talks about how this is a Vietnamese American conference, but we need to think of the Vietnamese American community in the context of the diaspora and the many different historical contexts and the different types of people, not just in America, but all around the world. She lists 4 major groups from before 1975 through French colonialism, refugees, and even in the refugee community, with refugee movements within the war from north to south, as well as after 1975. Going to, during this post-war era, many refugees went to Eastern Europe for workers to work, as well as students and brides and many other people who are reunifying with their family as they go. And so we think about diaspora in a larger context, and what does that mean? Natalie also talks about the different legislation, policies, and historical contexts that play a very important factor onto who is able to come to the US and who is not. And as we see, the UN has many different laws to bring Vietnamese refugees to the US, but when compassion fatigue fits in, or depending on the region and depending on the historical context, the Comprehensive Plan of Action complicated that in many different ways for many refugees who are not able to come to the US. Natalie says 80,000. And we think about going forward, especially in the 1.5 and second generations, not just in the US, but around the world, as diasporas reinsert themselves into familiar frames to give them a sense of belonging. And as we see transnational subjectivities, we see cultural exchanges between Vietnamese people in their respective countries, between Vietnamese people in other countries, and Vietnamese people who constantly renegotiate their relationship to Vietnam now. Some questions talk about the ethics of oral history and how do we create an empathy when talking with many of these people who have so much emotional baggage and trauma. And identity is very important, building trust is very important, and learning to meet people where they are, empathize them, not recreate past traumas, but find ways to bridge bridge gaps, and especially for the second generation, to think about creative ways to connect to their parents' experience. And then lastly, as we think about today, when we have a mix of all of these different people from different countries and backgrounds, how does the Vietnamese diaspora interact together? And this highlights the importance of preserving memory of different groups, and notes that as the Vietnamese diaspora is constantly being redefined by Vietnam and people who come into the diaspora are also continually to redefine their identities as Vietnamese people when they interact with the diaspora, and that leads to a future as we think about all of these complex and varied histories.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that great summary. If I may close this panel with a 20-second anecdote. About 10 years ago, somewhere in Germany, and I think it was Berlin, but I'm not absolutely sure now. I need to go back and look at. There was a anti-Chinese protest among Vietnamese, right? So it began at this corner of town, and then under the flag of the former Republic of Vietnam. So this group of Vietnamese marched under this flag from this corner in the city to the city hall, something like, or maybe to the Chinese consulate. 24 hours later, another group of Vietnamese immigrants did the same thing, except that they did it under the current flag of Vietnam. So I think, I thought of that anecdote as you went through the different types, right, to show the complexity of the Vietnamese diaspora down to the politics, leave alone the emotional contents and things like that. So please join me in thanking Dr. Nguyen.
Thank you.
I'm not going to let you go through like that, right? You need to translate in 1 minute.
Translate what?
Right.
Yeah, okay. Giáo sư Natalie Nguyễn trình bày rất là xuất sắc, rất là hay. Quý vị cần phải đọc cái quyển sách mà cô sẽ viết. Thank you. Cảm ơn quý vị đã có mặt hôm nay.